The little beggar was really very frightened, and he did not want to go back to his parents. He was hiding in his grandmother's petticoats. Meanwhile, his parents found that it was all taking a very long time and that their boy was still not back. The father went off to the grandmother's house, but he stumbled in the ruts on the road to Bagalayu, where they lived, and he fell down. Well, the little lad had left his grandmother's to go home, hoping to reach it before nightfall, and the wolf made him run fast. But the boy met his father on the way, and they went back together. Then the father took a cleft stick, hit the wolf with it, and killed him. They made a coat for the boy out of the wolf's skin, and he was so happy after all that to have the wolf's skin on his back. Lord, he had been so terribly frightened when he was taking his granny those black pudding poodoo. Oh, hello. I didn't see you. My name is Ian, and today we're talking about a collection of Little Red Riding Hood. This is from a textbook. It's from actually a slightly older edition of a textbook. Well, not too old, 2009, 2010. And I'm not a huge fan of it as a textbook, but this happens to be a good collection because this is a useful exercise to read a bunch of things that are purportedly the same story. And it's that purportedly the same story that's really what we're going to talk about. Because I can talk about Little Red Riding Hood per se, and there are, of course, some interesting things to note. One of, I think, the points that the authors dwell on in the introduction is that of all the tales that entered into sort of the popular canon, it's had a very interesting history. For one, it seems to have been published, collected at one point in however Charles Perrault collected back in the early 17th century, and was published and became so popular that it re-entered into a folk performance, basically adapted by the folk themselves, and then got recollected by the Grimms several decades later. So the Grimm's Little Red Cap and Perrault's Little Red Riding Hood have probably gone through a, for lack of a better word, popular culture, folk culture continuum cycle already. And this is well before we're talking about the mediated age as we might know it. And the other thing about Little Red Riding Hood, of course, is the sort of fascination with it as it's almost, you don't need to be particularly Freudian to see that there is some subtext going on. They hint towards it in passing, like Perrault's flourish of dressing her in the Little Red Riding Hood. Had he known what he was doing, or had they known what people would take from it, he might have thought otherwise, considering that he tacks on that moral that even back then they thought that the tale had to do with the function of a folk tale, the use of a folk tale, both function and use of a folk tale was about inculcating morality. And so Perrault sort of made sure that the moral that he wanted you to take from this was clear. But the Red Hood. Oh, the Red Hood and the correlation between Little Red Riding Hood and a clitoris. He probably didn't put those two and two together, but other people have. So you feel free to talk about all the potential subtext that some of the writers in this that they've collected make text. What's that line in Angela Carter's Company of Wolves when she's describing the cloak and the color of the cloak, and it's the color of Menzies. So making explicit one-to-one correlations between female fecundity and young female fecundity and Little Red Riding Hood herself. Go nuts, go for it. That's the wonderful thing about tales, is that they are open to many, many interpretations. And the interpretation is not inherently incorrect, because the interpretation is about taking this thing as you understand this thing to be. and imposing meaning on it. But what I wanted to do, and why we talk about this, and why it's good to read a number of tales that are purportedly the same story, is it gets us thinking about the idea of type and version. And so we have this thing, we have this nameable phenomenon, which is Little Red Riding Hood. And, well, what is it? It is it one definitive text? And then, well, no, clearly not. We know it in multiple forms. Are the multiple forms, save for one, all derivatives of that one? Are they all subsequent reinterpretations and retellings that ought to be measured up against the standard of some kind of original? Once upon a time, I think we fundamentally believed that. Once upon a time, we being folklorists, and I think to a certain extent that idea is still present. The amount of time you come across an article every couple of months in, I don't know, New York Times or Scientific American or The Atlantic or something about, the original version of this story is not what you were taught. It implies the original version, as opposed to a precedented version. I mean, there are certainly older versions. But what it basically is rather than it being a text with multiple variations, it is only variations. Variations that exist in some kind of sense of continuity with each other. But that sense of continuity is a creation. That sense of continuity is a collective understanding. And that's what folklorists call the difference between type and version. So a type is this thing. It's not quite the story. The story is what's enacted in a storytelling event. But it's a collection of ideas that have historically been lumped together in a particular order. But it's, at best, it's a framework. There's a history of it being performed on the large scale, internationally, and most likely on the small scale in terms of your specific history. One of the reasons why I use Little Red Riding Hood as the illustration, apart from the fact that this is already a handy pre-anthologized collection of texts, is that you are most likely familiar with this by virtue of, even if I go beyond sort of a Euro-North American centrism, it is so mediated into popular culture. It is so mediated into international variations. It gets carried along in the same way that other colonizer texts get carried along. That most likely anyone watching this is familiar with the bare bones of the story, the bare bones of the type. They have come across it in multiple, not simply they've come across it in a version, but probably in multiple versions. And if you were raised in a vaguely North American Eurocentric context, chances are you were exposed to almost literally hundreds of versions of this, including versions that were told to you in an oral tradition by a parent spontaneously saying it, let alone manifested in books and readers and anthologies of older tales and reworkings and comic books for youth and comic books for adults and slash fiction and all the various things. It's maybe it has to do with the fact that it is this sort of collection of potent pseudo-Freudian imagery. Maybe it is this sort of tension between the young female virginal small and the large older haggard rapacious male as sort of like a classic dyad or classic binary tension. Whatever the reason, it's a potent story and has probably been retold a number of times. So you have a history with it. And when I'm saying you have a history with it, that is not incidental. Because one of the things we want to think of is, well, what do you have a history of? you have a history of being exposed to these stories in sufficient numbers that when you come across a new iteration of it, you have this tension between knowing where it is going. And so, in some manner, partially understanding the text, and for our purposes, evaluating the performance in terms of that person meeting the things that you are familiar with. So how are they expressing a certain amount of fidelity to the text, to the received issues? I don't want to use text casually. To this, to the type, to this body of understanding of what this story is, how the story is meant to manifest. So how are they being faithful to that? What are they carrying forward? Well, at the same time, well, what are they doing with it? What is the creativity? What is the demonstration of the applicability of this thing to the particular moment socioculturally, but just as importantly, the particular moment of them being present to you and communicating something. So, again, when we talk about folklore and we talk about story and performance, and particularly folk literature, the audience is part of the creative process through a sort of, if, for lack of better words, this feedback mechanism, where the story is shaped in part by the storyteller's anticipation of what would be suitable for this audience, and then the audience reaffirms and or conditions that appreciation, and collectively the story gets told. So again, type and version. Type is the thing. This thing that we can more or less say is a constant. It isn't an original version, but it is the skeletal pattern that is more or less present most of the time in most iterations of the story. Enough so that we can confidently speak of them in a collective. And the flip side of that is version, each individual instance where something is being told, and that something is a deliberate retelling, or deliberately using and borrowing from this received cluster of ideas. That is this particular story. So as you go through the versions in this, you come across that one that's collected in the 19th century, but seems to be the only ethnographically collected one, which common conjecture is that is much more like what Perrault would have encountered, and then he fixed up. And with a little girl who is, let me read the section from you, because it's wonderful in that there's not a huge amount of narration in it. It's mainly dialogue. So much of this is told in dialogue, because much of the way that we tell stories is actually told in dialogue, and there's a little bit of transition. So the rather than the what big ears you have, what big eyes you have, it is just a series of questions back and forth. Undress, my child, said the Bazoo, and come and sleep beside me. Where should I put my apron? Throw it in the fire, my child, you don't need it anymore. Where should I put my bodice? Throw it in the fire, my child, you don't need it anymore. And so on, back and forth, until finally you get to this point. Oh, grandmother, that big mouth you have, all the better to eat you with, my child. Oh, grandmother, I need to go outside to relieve myself. Do it in the bed, my child. Oh, grandmother, I want to go outside. All right, but don't stay long. The Bizou tied a woolen thread to her foot and let her go out, and when the little girl was outside, she tied the end of the string to a big plum tree in the yard. The Bizou got impatient and said, "Are you making cables?" Are you pooping? Making cables. When he became aware that no one answered him, he jumped out of bed and saw that the little girl had escaped. He followed her, but he arrived at her house just at the moment she was safely inside. So, there's nakedness, there's bodily functions. It's not a wolf, it's a werewolf, it's a Bizou. a whole bunch of different things. And yet we recognize it by the time it shifts over to Perrault. And Perrault is the version that we are so very familiar with, except Little Red Riding Hood dies. And then we see the Grimm's version, and Little Red Riding Hood survives, not through her own agency. She is swallowed by the wolf, but then the woodcutter comes and chops her open, and everything is fine. And we can go through. So then you get to things like Angela Carter's The Company of Wolves, which is much more clearly a werewolf than a wolf scenario. Again, still operating within the realm of the fantastic. And then the ambiguous ending of that, where you don't know if she has been seduced or if she becomes the seducer. But it doesn't end in her death, and it doesn't end in his death. It ends in a coupling, however disturbing that coupling might be, because we don't quite grasp the level of consent that she has to that coupling. Is it out of fear? Is that out of survival? Is it out of acceptance? What? It's the ambiguity. That's fine. And ambiguity is, of course, part why we're here. But also, and then finally that last one, Francesca Leah Black's Wolf, the penultimate one. There's that poem at the end. But Francesca Leah Black's one about Wolf, which is, here's an interesting thought experiment in that if you hadn't been presented with this within the frame of here are a bunch of examples of Little Red Riding Hood, would you have read that story as a version? And there might be subtle hints. It's sort of one of those things that in retrospect you might go, this is a Little Red Riding Hood story. There are certain things like the way the man at the end has a sort of wolf-like grin, and obviously it's like, oh, she's going to her grandmother's. But it might be much more in retrospect, which is again an interesting play, and presumably Black is is building on that, the idea that there is ambiguity there and there is uncertainty, and it's like, oh, this is a familiar story being told again, with the idea perhaps she's having some kind of discursion with the entire tradition, in that these stories that are about direction towards are occasionally actually about direction from, and that it isn't so much grandmother's destination as it is the cottage that she is leaving. So some very interesting plays there. But all of this is to say that we have this set of expectations. We might be delighted that, oh, she's operating within this set of expectations. This is the Little Red Riding Hood story. But fundamentally, to think of type is to think of those things, that understanding of form, that understanding maybe even of symbol of that form that is present when we sit down the next time. Type is prospective. We might only understand them in retrospect, but it is all about moving forward. And there are a couple other terms you should probably know when we're talking about type and version. And that's the concept of the ecotype, or oikotype. Oiko, eco, from the Greek for hearth. It's the same term that ecology and economy come from. So, basically the understanding and the rhythms of the household, as it were. Hearth is a metonym for household. But really it has to do with sort of the community of, I don't know why I said that word in that particular way, of the community, of the region. I think it's a Carl von Sydow term, von Sydow, and he did, and so basically there's somewhere in between this abstraction of type and the version. We can nevertheless recognize clusters, so that this thing called Little Red Riding Hood, as it has historically been told in Germany, it tends to take this form. And again, that historically told doesn't mean generations upon generations upon generations into some primordial time, but this seems to be the settled set of expectations, which largely have to do with certain of the elements of the type being regularly articulated in this particular way. So if you can just think of, the marker of her as special in terms of the unit of the identification with an item of clothing. Well, in France, maybe thanks to Perrault, you have the riding hood. In Germany, you have the red cap. In another culture, you might have another kind of marker that notes her as distinct. And distinction is kind of important to the narrative. It's not critical, but it's kind of important. It doesn't have to be hood shaped. So, but you can talk about, so there is kind of a French type. There is kind of a German type. There is kind of a Chinese type. And again, those boundaries aren't absolute. It's just like a ever so slightly larger set of commonalities that are particular to this place. We could probably make an argument, and I don't know if anyone ever has, but there might be like sort of generational types that are less about, this would be sort of more complicated to map out, but we could probably map out the history of how an ecotype has changed diachronically, and then see if there are patterns among different ecotypes about diachronic change, and then see if there's sort of this generational thing, but how as the specifics of a culture operate and change, and the social dynamics morph from, agrarian to industrial, from a repressive religious context to slightly more liberal to secular to whatever. There might be multiple iterations that again manifest themselves in particular ways in particular places, but nevertheless we can see them as patterns. I wonder if there's a sort of a generational type as well. That's an interesting question. So, but what I want you to sort of grab from this is that the retelling of stories isn't an accident. The retelling of stories isn't incidental either. It is something that can be done. It is something that is done frequently, and that they become fundamentally a repertoire for telling, for communicating between the teller and the audience. We don't have to boil it down to specific functions or specific uses, because let's just think of that they are telling that the individual storyteller might be having a particular use in mind, something they're choosing to illustrate, but they borrow from the culture in part because they know that the audience will have a pre-grasping of it already. And when we think about tale, we might sometimes dismiss it with the idea that they are formulaic. We might dismiss it with the idea that they are literally generic, that they relate to genre. And we might literally dismiss it in terms of they are being typical, that they have to do with type. But unless you are committed to this idea of communicative acts having to be radically idiosyncratic, which is fine. It seems to be the domain of much literature, although not as much literature as people might imagine it to be, because we wouldn't have the idea of intertext otherwise. But this is, fairy tale, the process of telling tales and the relationship between type and version are fundamentally exercises in intertextuality. Because this thing that I am bringing into being in this instance, based in part on my understanding of or my understanding, and at least my presumption, that you are already somewhat in possession of a certain fluency with this type, is a way of taking this type and recasting it into a different light for repurposes. Sometimes it'll be for the exercise of traditionality. It's like, I want to hear this the way I've heard it before. And sometimes it'll be for playing with the form. And that's kind of why we read multiple versions of the same tale. It's why it is interesting to encounter multiple versions. And think of, because once we embrace the idea that they are all distinct intentional performances, then we move away from it being people are lazy in their creativity because they are reverting back to shared, common, and rehearsed plots, and rather take that as the starting point. And it's like, from these things, from this shared structure, shared across generations, and just as, if not more importantly, shared between teller and audience, a new thing can be created. That's my time. As always, I bid you well. Take care.